Hi, everyone, and welcome. As we gather together, please take time to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you are joining us from and what organization, community, diocese, parish you are representing today. As you enter in, please know that we are recording these sessions, which we will utilize for ongoing use. My name is Margaret Matiasevich, and I serve as the Executive Director of Word and Witness, a national community dedicated to catechesis and evangelization. And I also serve on the steering committee for the Catholic Cares Coalition. For those of you that are just joining us for the first time today, the Catholic Cares Coalition consists of 56 Catholic organizations dedicated to three particular goals. One, to leverage communication channels and resources to share consistent information about the importance and moral responsibility of individuals to accept the COVID-19 vaccine when available. Two, to provide human, spiritual, and pastoral support for those struggling to understand, affirm, and act on Catholic social teaching, including the teachings of Pope Francis and the U.S. Catholic bishops. And three, to advocate for the equitable distribution of the vaccine in the US and globally. You can find more information, resources, and news updates about the coalition on CatholicCares.org or follow our hashtag CatholicCares. Today is the last of 5 formation sessions. This experience will feature 2 unique speaker panels that will provide practical methods of accompanying one another through communal and individual trauma. This session will highlight lived experiences, innovative methods of community outreach, and personal stories as the foundation for understanding how to pastorally respond to our current realities in this pandemic. These panel discussions will provide replicable models through their accessible resources. I encourage you to post your insights and questions in the chat to enhance our experience and discussion today. To start us out, we will begin with prayer. And I will pass the mic and screen to John Michael Reyes, who has been our prayer leader for this series.
Thank you, Margaret, and hello, everyone. It's good to see all of you, and thank you for being here with us. When we started these formation sessions, our first prayer experience centered around Scripture. And so to bookend that experience for today, I would like to invite us to use Scripture as our foundation as we begin with prayer. And our prayer will be surrounded by the gospel. And so if any of you are familiar with Ignatian spirituality, our prayer experience today will be an Ignatian contemplation, which is prayer with Scripture. And it's using all your senses and using your imagination to place yourself in a scene from Scripture or with Jesus, and to use that and let the Spirit guide you. So Victoria, if you could begin the slideshow. So let us remember that we are in the holy presence of God. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. There was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. And though she had spent all she had on physicians, no one could cure her. She came up behind him and touched the fringes of Jesus' clothes, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. Then Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds surround you and press in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I noticed the power had gone out from me." When the woman saw that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." So friends, I invite you to take a deep breath in and slowly exhale. And I invite you to join me in this meditation on the Scripture that was just proclaimed. So imagine you're on a crowded street. You feel lost amongst the busyness. On your left, you hear men noisily haggling over a deal. On your right, you see women walking up the dirt path with water jugs on their heads. You breathe in dirt as playing children run past you, kicking up dust. Yet you get dizzy with all the commotion going around you. You are tired. You have been very tired for a long time, ever since the bleeding started and would not stop. You've tried every doctor in town, but they cannot help you. It's been 12 long years. Although you haven't been to the main part of town for a long time, today you found the energy to venture out into the crowds. You heard the one they call Jesus is coming to town today. There are stories of him healing many others. What do you hope for in encountering Jesus? What gave you the strength to venture to town today? Two women look at you with judging faces as they walk past you, and the only word you hear them whisper is, unclean. Oh, how this word unclean has haunted you over the past years. The bleeding, no, the stigma, wouldn't go away. What does it feel to be judged? How do you wish people saw you? Where do you find the courage to keep walking? As the crowd begins to part, you see Jesus walking with an official of the synagogue. What does Jesus look like? Do you question whether or not you still want to approach Jesus? Everyone around you is trying to get closer to him. Now that everyone is excited about seeing Jesus, there is less chance of them noticing or ridiculing you. Though he's only 6 feet away, it seems like a great expanse. If only he were right next to you, you could reach out to him, and surely his touch would bring healing. So you inch closer, careful to not bring attention to yourself. You see the softness and compassion in Jesus' eyes as he talks to the official. Jesus passes right in front of you, engrossed in conversation, and you think to yourself, I don't need his attention. I just need a simple touch. Closing in behind Jesus as he walks, you quickly reach out and feel the cloth of his tassel brush your fingertips. You feel a rush inside you. What has changed? You soon realize the bleeding has stopped. Interrupting the flurry of thoughts in your head, you hear Jesus asking, "Who touched me?" What are you feeling at this moment? You hear people around you say, "It was not me." Do you say anything? One of Jesus' friends points out to him that it may have been anyone surrounding him. Jesus, however, still wants to know who touched him. He said he felt his power go out. Did you feel this power enter you when you touched him? Realizing that Jesus so strongly noticed your touch, you approach him trembling. Why are you trembling? You fall on your knees in front of him, explaining your story. And yet Jesus' eyes are now intently focused on you. How does this make you feel? What do you see in Jesus' face? Jesus says, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Do you say anything or express gratitude towards Jesus? How do you feel as you stand up and walk back through the crowd? You've now been given a new lease in life. No more social stigma. Whereas your days were once spent home alone, each simple task being complicated by your condition, you now have restored strength. But Jesus' healing did much more than simply change your body. After 12 years of being judged and living in isolation, reaching out to touch Jesus brought you back into human contact. How do you feel at this moment? Liberated? Afraid? Excited? Anxious? Bringing these emotions with you, you slowly travel back to the present day. Thinking of your life right now, what are the things that need healing? Things that have been painful for you for a long time? What makes you feel isolated or powerless? What do you want Jesus to heal? Do you feel Jesus healing you right now? As Jesus sends you forth in peace, what will peace look like in your life here and now? Let us thank God for being with us in this time of prayer. As we take a deep breath in and slowly exhale, still recognizing the presence of God and the peace offered to you. Take a deep breath in and slowly exhale. And when you're ready, return to this space as we begin our conversations and listening. Amen.
What a beautiful prayer opportunity to give us pause, to listen within ourselves to our own need for healing and finding hope in the person of Jesus Christ and extending that gift of peace that we were so graciously given. Thank you, John Michael. That was a beautiful introduction to our session today. I would now like to give you a little introduction to our first panel, who will help us to continue to prayerfully respond to that invitation to healing. This panel will highlight a creative parish initiative out of the Santa Clara region of California, which has been supported by the Conrad and Hilton Foundation, addressing generational trauma. Joining us are three great speakers: Jimmy Chauvin, who has been with Catholic Charities of Santa Clara County since early 2019. He oversees major gifts and special events And prior to Catholic Charities, he was a fundraiser at Stanford University for 1 year and Santa Clara University for 9. Father John Pettigo, who is the Director of Advocacy and Community Engagement at Catholic Charities of Santa Clara County, has been awarded the 2008 Immigrant Advocate of the Year by Siren, which stands for Services, Immigrants, Rights, and Education Network. He's also been the 2019 Director's Reward recipient from the Human Relations Commission of Santa Clara County and the 2014 Cesar Y. Chavez Si Se Puede Award by the Chavez Family Vision Foundation. He was previously the board chair of the Interfaith Council Economics and Justice Board. Bridget Balahaja, who is the program manager, parish engagement at Catholic Charities based in San Jose, California, is also joining us. She has assured community members of the connectedness of necessary resources for their viability and to give them dignity of life. We welcome our three speakers to this wonderful panel, which will look again at trauma through a generational lens and offer us some hope of new ways and models. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you all so much for being with us today. I think we're going to let John start with our intro on the division and more of the work that we do here at Catholic Charities.
Yeah, okay. We're going to do, I'm looking at the, so I'm Father John Pettigo, Director for Advocacy Community Engagement, and want to talk a little bit about very quickly on the partnership, why we started to do this work with the parishes. When I came on board, I had reorganized the department or the division because the bishop had asked me, if you what we really need is to get the Catholic Charities and the parishes connected, because they're really not truly connecting in the way they need to connect. And so that began the question of going out and talking to all the pastors. What is it that you see your needs are? What do you really need? What are the things that are troublesome for you? And this is so I spent a year doing that, and after that, I talked to also the people in the Catholic Charities to figure out what are they doing. And what we kind of came up with in the early iteration of this idea of working with parishes directly was finding out what is the problem that we're trying to solve. And it really is healing, because Christ speaks about healing, the healing of the woman who is hemorrhaging, the healing of the lepers, and just the healing of relationships. Recognizing that many of the characters from the gospel stories are people that have experienced significant loss or significant marginalization. And so recognizing what marginalization can do to you, or what violence, what these different emotional realities that deal with people, it's always a sense of separation. So the pastors were looking at how do we, kind of deal with obviously we have homelessness, obviously we have a number of other big issues, but it's really about the healing piece, especially as we recognize it in the pandemic, in the early months of the pandemic, we recognize that there's something that needs to be done. So that's the main problem we're trying to solve, is bringing some kind of a healing to parishes. What can we do with bringing programs that Catholic Charities has to the community in a specific location? So the first step was really building trust in a community, really listening to community, doing a lot of listening to the parishioners, to the parish leaders. And then we got enough support to bring on Bridget, and she'll talk a little bit about her perspective on that healing dimension, and specifically in regards to trauma. But what we had recognized in parish ministries is that there are a lot of kind of healing that does happen by bringing people into relationship with each other, into relationship with the divine. But the big thing that we started to look at, and this is where the design dimension for the program came for me, was integral human development. So it's Pope Francis's kind of philosophical framework that provides kind of the content and the framework for me in terms of looking at a design of a division. It's like looking at a person is not just it's not just about making decisions, which is obviously very key, that we all need to make choices. We all need to exercise our choices about how we live our life and how we, move through the day. But sometimes those choices are mitigated or imposed upon by external realities like poverty, like violence. And as we found, common to all of this is trauma. So when you start to deal with these external realities, and some of them are social ostracization, some of these are other kinds of social realities of political marginalization, economic marginalization, emotional marginalization, all of these marginalizations create some level of trauma and disconnection from people. And so we started to say that, a person to be whole really needs to have some deeper sense of connectivity spiritually as well as practically. So I just want to do this. That our idea for this was to kind of create, let me get this pattern up here. It's, oh gosh, where it is, but I had it, but that's all right. I'll just stop the share. But the idea is that we wanted to kind of have this idea of like, we have these listening circles where we listen deeply to a person. Then secondly, we go from listening to where people are at. Then we get them to see if they're really okay with sharing it with other people. And sharing with other people is really about the encuentro or the encounter. And this is where we walk and accompany a person in their darkest hour and their most difficult time, and figuring out what does that mean. In some cases, it's very, very complex, and we really need someone with specific training to walk with them and understand the multiple challenges that face with them. And so we have a social worker, a couple of social workers that we work with them, and so the clients or people that come to the parish are kind of developing a sense of let's walk with a person. The second piece that we do as we develop this program, working in combinations in a parish, they're paired with a person that is going to be just like them, from the neighborhood, from the community, but is deeply trained into listening, and we call it accompaniment. Accompaniment or acompañamiento or encuentro is a mutual transformation, so that we are putting people into a relationship, because those relationships heal. They bring people back into the community, they bring people back into themselves. And so this connectivity that we see, this encuentro experience that we use in accompaniment, is designed in multiple parishes where we train parishioners to do deep listening and walk with people through their journey. And in that walking with their journey, we can, and Bridget will talk to you about how we connect them to other kinds of services that are essential services that people may not be accessing at this moment, but are really truly essential for their well-being. And so that's kind of the work that we do on that score. And the other piece, and just really kind of bring a summary to all of this, is that the idea is that parishes own all of this as a ministry. That it's not just Catholic Charities comes in with a whole bunch of stuff to help people work through these issues, but we come in with a sense of partnership with the parish. So with that partnership with the parish, we're able to develop programs and bring programs to them directly. We're able to open up to help people with immigration. We're able to help people with obviously the food work. We're piloting a number of food distribution through vehicles, as well as in-person markets where people receive food, and farmers markets where people can come and talk with each other in a very informal but careful, loving and care-filled environment. These are models that we use in parishes, but because parishes are ill-equipped for responding to these multiple and complex needs of people through Catholic Charities partnerships, we're able to kind of bring this work to them. Also, as a result, this deep work and encuentro model and the network impact model that we're using, it allows us to partner also with healthcare providers, the county, and a couple of community clinics. And that allows us, that has provided for us a platform for working with people who need COVID education, who at first needed testing and now need vaccines. And we're continuing to do more in-depth outreach to deeply affected communities. So we'll talk a little bit about how that actually works out using this platform of trauma care, parish partnerships, and in the context of a parish community in ministry, how that approach has allowed us to, work more deeply, adeptly, and to be more agile in how we respond to the challenges that the pandemic has brought. So I'm going to toss it over to Bridget, to talk about what she's been doing.
Thank you, Father John. Yeah, so thank you all again for being here today. We're really, really excited to be able to share with you a little bit more about what we've been doing, and hope that it serves you. So my background is I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And I, prior to being in this position, was primarily working with refugees and asylum seekers. I worked in Western Africa and in Northern Africa, doing social services basically there, in a variety of different capacities. And when I came back, I really wanted to focus in on trauma, specifically how that lives in our bodies, how it plays out in our behavior and our decision-making processes. And I knew that I wanted to continue to work in the community. So when John invited me to come in and join this agency and to talk more about and learn more about how we could impact and change the traumatic narratives that are being experienced by our communities, I knew it was a good fit. And so what's happened since then, knowing all the background that John just explained to you about how this project even got started, what we did was we kind of combined the theological piece of everything that John just went over, and then more of the social service constructive part, which is where I bring my expertise. And some of you may be familiar with something that's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences tool. So this was something that was developed by Kaiser and the Center for Disease Control in the 1980s. And it really looks at how trauma impacts our physical health. So that was the impetus for the whole study, was to look at, what are the negative health outcomes that take place in a person's life that are highly correlated, if not caused by trauma that we experience prior to turning 18. And what I really wanted to look at after 30 years of research of this happening and seeing the strong correlation and causal effects on people's health, I wanted to really look at this from an economic standpoint and say, what's the relationship there between trauma and people's ability to economically thrive and sustain themselves in what is one of the hardest areas hit by poverty in the United States. So Santa Clara is a really interesting county. Most of you probably know our county by a different title, by Silicon Valley. And a lot of the challenges that occur here are because we've got this huge disparity. We've got people who are making literally millions, billions with a B out here. And then we've got people who are barely surviving. We have a huge challenge with homelessness. We have an enormous challenge with people who are about to be evicted, especially because of COVID. So when we started this program in 2019, so we're still a baby program, we started taking ACE scores. So it's a public tool. You can Google it, just look ACE scores, and it'll come up with the tool right away. And what we notice is that whereas an average American would score at about a 2 or a 3 out of 10 on that tool, meaning that we've had at least 2 events of trauma in our childhood, our population that we would serve, we're scoring about a 9 out of 10. So when I say our population, I'm not just talking about one race, one gender, one background. These are people that are experiencing what I call the intersections of poverty. So these are people who are undocumented, and they're also single mothers, and they're also working 3 jobs because they have to, and they're unhoused. So there's lots of different compounding factors of trauma and poverty here. And so you can't just work within one system. It has to be a bunch of different systems that are pulling together to support this person or this family. So when John and I started bouncing trauma around and kind of figuring out what would we do with this, and what could we do differently, knowing that the system that's in place right now isn't really working, accompaniment was the first thing that came to our mind. So John's kind of already gone over accompaniment, but briefly to summarize it again, we provide 16 hours worth of training on trauma, what it does to our body, how it changes our decision-making patterns, and our envisioning for the future, our ability to think forward. And then we also talk about vicarious trauma, so preventing that trauma in our communities when we're serving others. We talk about service navigation, how to get people connected to the services that they are most in need of. And then what those volunteers do is they meet on a weekly basis with the clients and talk to them more about, what's coming up for you in this moment. How is this week impacting you, and helping them to kind of move through that deep guided listening. And then on the social service aspect, talking to them more about, okay, client, I heard you say that you need access to food resources. I'm going to teach you how to access that resource. So it's not about me as the volunteer holding on to that knowledge. It's about me actually teaching the client to become self-sufficient, so that when they have another challenge in the future, they know where to go, and they know how to, most importantly, navigate those strong feelings that come up for them that can sometimes stymie us and stop us from being able to move forward. So that was accompaniment. Out of accompaniment, we heard the clients' voices loud and clear in the community, really saying, we can't only do this. This is great. I love listening. I love the fact that I finally have someone that is truly there for me. And this has been so healing. And I can't get to the doctors on time because I'm going to lose my parking spot. The food bank is only open during the hours when I'm at work and I have to go to work. I'm not able to see an attorney for the same reasons that I just said. So we kind of took this idea that I had experienced firsthand when I was serving in Morocco, where when I lived in Morocco, there was a group of guys that would come with their camels and all their other stuff, and they would plop down in the middle of the city on a Wednesday afternoon. And it was not supported by the government at all. There was no federal funding for it, but those guys brought all of these different services and other things to sell with them from various parts of Morocco, because it was a little bit of a caravan. And the community knew that on Wednesday afternoons, these people were going to be there, and they knew that they could come and they could experience, the togetherness aspect of it, and that they could get everything that they needed. So we said parishes are those trusted hubs here in the United States, where people can truly come, be themselves, feel like they can access the services that they need in an unstigmatized environment. So we invited in doctors, we invited in food banks, we invited in substance abuse counselors, we invited in immigration attorneys, we took in someone who made hot meals, and these are all external organizations. So this is not just Catholic Charities carrying all of this. This is using all of our external partners in the community who have their own expertise, and inviting them into the parishes, and acknowledging that the parish is the safe space in the community where everyone is welcome and where everybody can access services at a time that's convenient for them. So all of our clinics, all of our community markets are held in the evenings on a weekly basis, come rain or come shine. We're only closed from Christmas to New Year's. And even then we have referrals of where you can go. But what's happened there is that, yes, people are accessing the services, but more importantly, people are able to come and be in communion with one another. And they're able to do so in a way that feels safe. So whereas there used to be this kind of stigma around, oh, I don't want to go to the food bank because that's miserable and I don't like standing in line and it's embarrassing. Now they're coming to this. And we've got mariachi bands, we've got, sometimes we have DJ, we've got whatever. So we make it a very welcoming environment. So this, in combination with accompaniment and the fact that we have our own professional trained staff of social workers, case managers who are able to be on the ground and say, help fill in those gaps in between when people really do need a little bit more guidance. That has made for a recipe for success for us. Now, that was all in 2019. And in 2020, COVID hit. And I went on maternity leave. So we had a little bit of a challenge. Father John and one of our social workers really had to step in, and we had to completely figure out how we were going to do this. So all of our community markets that used to just be walk up, stand in person, those had to change. We had to move to doing a lot of drive-through work, but the services still had to continue. So our community markets look a little different now, but they're still going. Accompaniment shifted over to a virtual platform. And most importantly, we really realized that we needed to do a lot of work around COVID. Making sure, most importantly, that people got the vaccine. So when the vaccine first became available, we took a long, hard look at who are the populations that were most suffering from COVID. And when I say COVID, I'm not just talking about the disease itself. I'm talking also about the economic disparities that happen because of it. So people who are being displaced, people who can't afford to take time off of work to quarantine, people who are maybe afraid to even get tested because of what it could mean economically for their family, the parents who are trying to raise their children and be their parent, their child's friend, and their child's psychologist and their child's teacher all at once, right? And what we found was that as far as racial disparities go, that there is a huge divide between Caucasians, Asians, and Latinx people. And what we really saw was that in Gilroy, there was a huge hesitancy of getting the vaccine. So when we were, thrilled to hear that the Hilton Foundation wanted us to support us in all of this, we knew that Gilroy was the place that we needed to start by going down there and doing education. What we have found is that while flyers are a helpful tool, they're not the only way to get, and they're not the most effective way to get the word out, right? So flyering can be great, helps people to remember an event or whatever else is coming up. It's a physical reminder of something that they can read later on. The most important thing, though, has been conversations from our Spanish-speaking staff, who were able to go out into the neighborhoods, literally door knocking with masks on, but door knocking and saying, hey, have you gotten your vaccine today? And hearing the stories of people who are saying, I'm not getting the vaccine because I heard on the radio that it's the mark of the devil, true story. Or I'm not getting the vaccine because I'm worried about the side effects and I can't afford to miss a day of work afterwards, or it's a microchip that's getting planted in our brains, whatever. Our staff who look like the community, who speak the language of the community and are able to come and say, hey, we're giving out the vaccine on parish property. And not only that, but I have a pastor here who's able to talk about, the message that Pope Francis is sending all of us, that it's our moral obligation to get this vaccine right now. And that is what changed people's minds. So whereas we were seeing vaccine clinics around the county distributing, 10 to 15 vaccines at some of their other sites, in one day we were able to get 97 vaccines into people's arms. And that's a huge success. And the way that we did that was by having this vaccine clinic being held by the county on parish property right after Mass. So people could come from outdoor Mass and they could come over and get their shot. And not only that, but we had other people there from our staff that were able to support in giving out free backpacks, supplies for people that they couldn't otherwise afford, helping them get enrolled into public benefits, making sure that they understood that every day we're at the parish, we're there for food, we are there for baby supplies, all the other things that they need to be able to continue to survive and thrive. And so, in our program, we're trying to move forward with this as best as we can. We're really excited that in the next month, we're going to be hosting 4 more vaccine clinics at different parishes in just September. So we feel like we're on a roll, and we feel like this could maybe help and work in the rest of the United States, right? What would happen if we got more pastors, more parish communities involved in having that secret sauce of conversations and flyers and saying, really, where are you guys at? What is the mythology that you're holding on to? What is the fear that you're holding on to? And let's talk about it as a community to see about what we could do differently.
Jimmy.
I'll pass it over to Jimmy.
Hi, everyone. So I'm a fundraiser. I'm not a program designer like Bridget, and I'm not a kind of visionary thought leader on this like Father John. But my job is to figure out how does this program operate, and how is it scalable and replicable throughout our county. So we have about 2 million people in Santa Clara County, give or take, and a little over 50 Catholic parishes in Santa Clara County. And what's amazing about this program is we're currently operating the parish engagement program at, it's about to be 4 parishes. And each one of them is hyper-localized into the services that they provide. And that's really important. When Bridget and Father John say, hey, we want to expand to Mountain View, or we want to expand to Gilroy, they go and they survey those areas and they figure out what is this community needing in order to heal from within? What can we provide as Catholic Charities, or who can we partner with bring those services to their neighborhood. And what really is special is that each one of these is different. Each one of these sites has their own secret sauce that works for them. Another thing that we found is that this program is really, what's really great about it is that you can leverage staff within their community to train these accompaniment volunteers to make dramatic impact in the community. When this program started, it was Father John, Bridget, a Jesuit volunteer corps member, and that was about it. And they were really influencing and helping like thousands of people a week in terms of, I mean, that might not have been households, but thousands of people, because one person from a household would come to a parish engagement site, find resources, get help, and then bring those resources back to their house. So each week, thousands of people were being assisted by 2.5 full-time employees. And now, as we are starting to expand and we're starting to really gain momentum within this program, we're finding that the scalability and the replicability just relies on, it really is just staff on our end. That's the funding model of it, is for the most part it's staff. But one staff member can run a couple of parish engagement sites, or can oversee a couple of parish engagement sites. They can then train those volunteers, and those volunteers and those accompaniment people or accompaniment volunteers can then go out and change the trajectory of thousands of people. So it's really a wonderful, so my job is to talk to donors and ask and tell this story. And it's wonderful to be able to tell them that, take them to a site, show them the number of people that are there, have them walk through the hundreds of cars that are lined up each week for our food distribution, and say, we want to do this at every parish in the county. And your gift, your support will allow us to do that down the road. And so it's been one of these programs, as Bridget said, it started in 2019, but it was like the latter half of 2019, kind of the second half of 2019. So we're really 2 years old in this program. And I think the future is bright for it. It's something that I talk about. We've got about 40 different programs at Catholic Charities, but I talk about the parish engagement program at almost every donor conversation that I have, because it really shows how we can not only provide wraparound services to our community, but we can do it in partnership with other nonprofits in our community. We don't own this. The outcome of this program is not just due to the work that we're doing at Catholic Charities. It's due to this network and trust that we have of other nonprofits in our county. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to get across, is that it's just something that we can put a relatively small amount of resources into and have just this tremendous output and tremendous impact throughout Santa Clara County.
That's so wonderful. Thank you all, and welcome to Father John's cat. I'm a cat lover myself, so glad to see your cat joining us. So I have a few questions that I'd like to put forth to you all, if that's okay. I know that one of the foundational pieces you identified was, one, identifying the problem that you're looking to solve in your community. And it seems that you've done that so well, using that data analysis, using that deep listening posture, and coming up with a method of how to approach this from a multi-pronged effort. But how do you advise people joining us today, and this is their first time to even consider identifying a problem to solve, but really kind of using that overarching kind of naming of the problem? I appreciate that you named healing as a critical problem to kind of, navigate providing that to your communities. Do you have any, tips on how people can begin those conversations in their communities to help kind of get that overarching problem named so that it empowers people?
Well, I'll go first because I think the first thing is most important is having a relationship with the pastors. if you're going to do it through the faith community. If you're going to use it through the Catholic parishes, you need to have a priest on board. You need to have a pastor on board. The bishop needs to be on board. This is Bishop McGraw, who's now retired, Bishop Emeritus. It was his desire to kind of get this going, so that we had that backing. The current bishop we have now is, is very supportive of the work we're doing. He's come out to the sites a number of times, and he's actually volunteered and put food in people's cars and talked with clients. So that's really important to have that, because in the Catholic world, the church is not quite a democracy. It's more like North Korea. It's like we have the great leader, and then everyone kind of follows more or less. So you need to have your bishop supporting, and then you need to have the pastors that support the effort. And as you know, that each pastor is kind of like a warlord, and and like an Irish king. And so some of them are going to be with you, some of them won't. So you really need to know, because it doesn't make sense to stay in one place where you're not welcome. So you just take your chanclas off and you shake them off and you go to the next place. But I think that the most important thing for me is working with the colleagues and the priests that I know. And my first year when I did this, we started this work, I would bring a bottle of booze to each pastor and a report, and I would give them the bottle of booze on the condition that they would read the report. Now that didn't always happen, but that we did that for a couple of years just to kind of bring them on board. I think now since the pandemic, they've really seen what we can do, so they're really supportive. But I think it's also getting the right person on your team, like Bridget, who does the actual ongoing day-to-day relationship with the pastor. So I'll just let Bridget talk about it from her perspective of how she gets everyone to do everything, because you get the pastors to do all these amazing things, and it's like, I never got them to do that.
I don't know what it is. I think it's conversations with the pastors. I think it's also asking, what does the community really need? So from a logistical standpoint, I would highly advise that anybody who's going to try and do this, that, in their communities, start with the community first and lead with the community voice. So what I mean by that is, before we move into any kind of, into any parish, we do surveying. And so it's about 10 questions long on each survey. And they're really basic questions, do you feel like you're going to be able to pay next month's rent? Do you find yourself feeling sad very often? Do you have children? How are your relationships with those children? And what that does is it allows us to actually see, where are the areas where people are pretty good. Maybe this community is doing well with access to food, but they're showing us that their mental health and their relationships with their children are really suffering. So that would kind of guide our answer of saying, well, maybe we need to bring in like a family resource center there. Maybe we need to bring in more therapy or whatever else. Then that's the information that you bring to the pastor. So you lead with that community voice of, hey, we did this. We looked at the survey. We talked to your congregants. We talked to, everybody else that's around. And we really learned that this is kind of what's challenging right now. And a lot of the times pastors, they want the best for their people, right? And so they'll talk to you more about the ways that might be possible at their parish. Some pastors are all about it and they'll let you have a full-blown community market on their property. And other pastors simply don't have that flexibility, but they might allow a social worker, to come in for a couple hours, and they might allow for just accompaniment trainings to take place. So there's a lot of flexibility and bandwidth there.
As you talk about that accompaniment aspect, I was really intrigued of that training process. Can you speak more about how clients are paired with accompaniment volunteers, and what kind of, besides the 16-hour training, what is like the discernment process for this to become a volunteer for that? Because that's an important part of building trust and building relationships, especially with people who look like the community but want to offer gifts and talents. But how can what is that process like?
Yeah, such a good question. So our training isn't, it's 16 hours, so it's not like we would ever just do like one massive session of sitting in, but our trainings are held over the course of a month. So there's 4 different sessions that are broken down into those chunks of hours. And we talk about different topics in each one. So we'll always start with an informational session where we're just saying, you're not, agreeing to do anything here. In fact, for the entire training, you're not agreeing to do anything. You could get through the end of this process and say, I I've learned so much, and I've learned that this isn't for me, that maybe my talents are best spent putting food in the backs of people's cars or doing other kinds of volunteerism for parish engagement. And we've had those volunteers who have said, I carry so much of my own trauma still, that what this training process has done for me is that I've learned that I need to re-enter therapy, or I've learned I need to, do whatever I need to do to heal. For others, though, we've learned that, we've had people who have come to us and have had that really prayerful, meaningful experience of saying, I went through the training and I'm still kind of on the cliff. I don't know. Am I fit for this? Am I not? And for those people, we have actually, for all of our volunteers, we have a questionnaire. It's just a simple Google form that talks about, who are you as a volunteer? What interested you in this program? Why are you here? What do you hope to bring and to offer? And what are your talents that you hope to support someone in? And probably just as importantly, what are your triggering populations? If you've been through domestic violence, if you have been through the loss of a child, it might not be super healing or helpful to the client for you to be paired with somebody else who's going through that right now, right? That might just raise up a lot of red triggers for you. So for us to get to know the volunteers better, it helps them to kind of work through what populations they think they could be most helpful with. And it also helps us to make that happy marriage between a client and a volunteer. And we've seen a lot of success but between this, of volunteers really having that transformational experience on their end as well, because they are coming back into this into this work in a different space of healing and fullness that's offered now in their lives.
Bridget, tell them how many people that we have successfully gone through the volunteer accompaniment training.
In total, since 2019, we've probably trained well over 250 volunteers.
And those are all from parishes. So when people say, oh, my parishioners never do, we started with 3 volunteers at Our Lady of Refuge, 3. And after kind of speaking with folks, doing a lot of listening, we got 83 people. Mm-hmm. So it can be done. This is not a magic thing. It's just sort of like you set out the vision, you set out the opportunity, and then Bridget brings good food to the accompaniment trainings, and then people stay. And they love Bridget because she's so amazing.
Nice. I think that's inspiring to learn that you started from 3. I think that brings a sense of hope to everybody on this call, that you can start from a really small circle and make a great impact. Thank you for that. I had another question. I heard the statement that trauma affects our physical health, but also affects economics of a community or family. And since both of those things are so unsteady right now, people have a lot of uncertainty about their physical health, people have a lot of uncertainty about their own economic status. How do we consider best practices in communication as the communities in need, like those statistics are changing? I only ask, I had a friend, a professional friend, she lost her job in the middle of this pandemic, and she found herself attending food banks when previously she was a person serving at them regularly. And how difficult that was for her to have a conversation with her family and friends that this was her reality, and kind of, that sense of trauma and healing for her. How do you have any recommendations on best tips of outreach and communication efforts that considers that changing demographic, even in a local community that might have looked very different pre-COVID?
Well, I could talk about the first thing is that we start with from the accompaniment side that moves into advocacy, because there are certain actual thresholds that are determining what is poverty and not poverty. So our funders are very, very anxious for us to pass the economic threshold of poverty. But that's not the only measure of what poverty is, because you can be very poor and still live a very enriching life. But our funders are very interested about getting people out of economic poverty. So that's really a bit of a challenge for us to do that, to figure that out. So the mechanics of it is like we work with Bridget's trauma-informed work. And then my part on my team that I'm developing now which is adding on to the team that we started with Bridget, is developing the advocacy angle, which is using the first voice of the people that are directly, those most closest to the pain are the ones that have the most powerful solution. But people who are closest to the pain are also deeply traumatized. So we need to kind of go back and work with Bridget's team a lot to be sure that we are not asking people who are traumatized to get involved in a policy campaign that's going to help them. That's going to be very difficult. So that's kind of how that piece that we're looking at that piece, but I'll let Bridget maybe answer the earlier part, which is how do we discern people and all that kind of stuff that Margaret was asking.
Yeah. So, I mean, I hear you, Margaret, especially when you're giving that very personal example of a person who, had to go back and tell their folks about what's going on. And unfortunately, that's really, really true, I think, for a lot of folks across the United States, of figuring out, maybe they were doing well or, surviving in some senses, and then having to come back from this and say, I lost my job and now I'm not. And this is my first time going to a food bank, or this is my first time ever having to ask for rental assistance. I wish I had a happier answer, but unfortunately, this is, if you think things are bad now, they're about to get a lot worse in the next month. What we've been seeing is that because of the federal eviction moratorium that just ended, states are leaning towards doing their own endings of their policies as well, if they haven't already concluded them. So we're expecting that there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be entering homelessness for the first time. And these are not just people, they are families, they are children. And so getting to a point where we can have a conversation about really what's happening on the ground, how do we destigmatize this, and get people, to a space where they're able to discuss what's happening in their lives is really, really important. So we've got 2 ways of doing that right now. We've got accompaniment, but we've also got the listening circles that Father John mentioned earlier on in this call. So those are centered through mind-body practices. So these are our practices that are coming out of ancient wisdom, that are coming out of tribal knowledge, that are coming out of, cultural perspectives that have been around for millennia, and that now only now, recently have Western universities started studying them and validating them. So what happens a lot in these healing circles and in these workshops that we offer also outside of parishes or out of parishes are, meditation, teaching things like movement, shaking, dancing, cooking, gardening, like all of these things that we know inherently are very supportive of us, but come back to 2 central things. We're healing trauma through the movement and breath work of our bodies, which is super critical. And we're healing trauma by being in communion with one another. So we're coming together as a community so that we can see that other people like us are also going through really challenging times. And that takes away that isolation of what you were talking about, Margaret, of your friend who had to go forward and say, this is happening to me. It takes away the stigma of having to ask for help, because we know now that we're in a boat full of people who are going through similar issues and are willing to work with us as well.
And I think the other piece that we want to add to that is that we're also doing case following cases. So it's not like people just going to a cooking class or just doing folkloric dancing, but those people are also followed through the process, and that we're tracking to see how they're doing. So it's the idea, we call it la cultura cura, is really one of our foundational principles that we're working with one of our family resource centers as a partner on this. And it really is about creating these family community activities where the family, the full family is engaged in well-being. And so we kind of partner with these family resource centers in a parish and family resource centers in a different neighborhood. And we're able to we're going to be connecting folks to these experiences, but with Bridget and her team, we'll be able to track this. So it's not just anecdotally, well, people are doing better because they're going to a yoga class or something like that, or they're doing Zumba, but it's being able to really follow that person and to show Jimmy, and therefore Jimmy showing the funders, this kind of activity, well-being actually raises up this whole thing of getting vaccines. And really quick, normal vaccine events get 2 to 14 people at the most. That's what the county's been getting when they go out. When they went to our site, 97 doesn't seem like a whole lot of numbers, but when you're comparing it to 14 people getting vaccinated, and then you look at our event that has 97 people being vaccinated, this is where we're saying this is all the change happens.
That's wonderful and inspirational. And I think it's really motivating for all the different types of ministries and church work, folks that are a part of this coalition. We really could be supportive of this model with our different efforts. You know, being from an organization that represents catechesis and evangelization, we could really implement a lot of what you've already proven as successful. In fact, it's in our documents to do quite a bit of what you're saying, especially accompaniment. So it really gives us an inspiring opportunity to break down some silos and be more collaborative for affecting the common good in our communities. Well, I'd like to thank you all so much for your time. We'll come back later for a little bit of large group discussion at the end of our event, but I'd like to go ahead and introduce our second panel, which consists of two speakers on the theme of trauma, providing a counseling perspective and storytelling experience. Joining us are Reverend Kenneth Schmidt, who is a Catholic priest of the Diocese of Kalamazoo, where he serves as the advocate for priestly ministry and support. He earned a master's degree in counseling psychology and is a licensed professional counselor. He is a co-founder of the Trauma Recovery Program in his diocese and co-founder and executive director of Trauma Recovery Associates, also known as TRA. It educates and fosters the development of organizational leaders, human service providers, and trauma survivors themselves to respond more effectively to the impact of childhood trauma. TRA has trained in 23 states and 7 countries and provides programs for childhood trauma survivors throughout Southwest Michigan, as well as a free online program for people that deal with stress during this pandemic. He has published in the areas of canon law, pastoral theology, psychology, and spirituality, including a book about trauma and spirituality, and another book that paraphrases the Psalms as prayers for people in addiction and recovery. Also joining us is Victoria Radley Smith, who is the Director of Mission Integration for Inward and Witness. She has more than 15 years of professional catechetical experience and has previously worked at the diocesan and parish level. Victoria is passionate about formation, accompaniment, and mentorship. She recently completed the Strong Foundations for Pastoral Leaders program offered through the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. As a Southern California native, she resides in Burbank, California. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Margaret. Father Ken, I'll let you go first. You're muted though, Father Ken.
Got so excited. We're going to hear some overlap with especially things that Bridget said, and I think, but some divergences, not because we're opposed to one another, but just because we're looking at the situation slightly differently and approaching probably some different populations or subsets of the populations. Our work began with the clergy sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church and trying to respond on a local level to people who were being triggered because of their own childhood trauma. They had nothing to do with clergy sex abuse, but nevertheless was being stirred up again. So I want to start with the definition of trauma. And it's very broad. It's an event or a series of events that interrupts normal human development. So that's very encompassing. ACEs is an instrument Bridget referred to that speaks to about 10 of those. It makes a list of 10 and it basically says, do you have this? Do you have this? Do you have this? But ACEs is also limited because it just doesn't incorporate the real number of possible kinds of traumatic events, which can include any kind of abuse, neglect, abandonment, divorce, death, natural disasters, illness of another person or yourself, violence, and even the experience of not belonging can all constitute trauma. Personally, as I've worked now for almost 20 years with trauma survivors, I've come to my own kind of definition or understanding which links all of those together. And that is that I believe that trauma is an experience of vulnerability, an experience of lack of safety, a profound experience of powerlessness. And for me, that is the connection of the pandemic to trauma. I think the experience of the pandemic has been one giant worldwide experience of powerlessness. People are living in vulnerability to a potentially deadly disease. They don't know where it is, who has it, how they catch it, how they can protect themselves. They feel powerless to fight it. It's worldwide, and people are very reactive when they encounter things then that make them fear, that make them feel vulnerable, that make them feel powerless. And when we have those kinds of deep feelings, then we tend to do very extreme things in order to escape those feelings and to escape that experience. And so the extremeness may show in our thinking, the extremeness may show in our emotions, and the extremeness may show in our behavior. Our focus has been childhood trauma, but we're working with adults who had childhood trauma. And one of the things that we realize is that when we have any kind of new experience or anything that even triggers the old experience, up come the old feelings, up comes the old behavior. It's fresh and new. And so the pandemic isn't only an experience of powerlessness in itself, but for many people, it's also a trigger to their original experiences of powerlessness, whatever kind of abuse or neglect that they experienced in the past. What we know about trauma is that it has very expectable results. So if I start listening to someone who's telling me about their childhood trauma, I can start asking them very simple questions that make me sound like a magician, like I'm reading their mind. It's like, how do you know all that? Well, I know all that because you're a trauma survivor, and this is what trauma survivors think, and this is what trauma survivors do. We know it's expectable. One of our pet phrases is that it's a normal response to an abnormal event. So the outcomes are pretty well known. What happens, however, is that most people don't identify their trauma as trauma. They might say it was something bad that happened. They might, unfortunately, especially in childhood trauma, think that what happened to them is normal. That because it's their experience, it just seems like it's within the norm. And so they don't identify it as trauma, even if anybody else hears it. I remember a man coming to me, and I won't go into the long story, but I basically said, do you have any trauma? And he said, no. And he wasn't lying to me. But what came out eventually was that his father used to hit him with a baseball bat. And I think most of us would constitute that as something that we could call trauma. But he didn't call it trauma, not because he was lying about it, but because it was his norm, right? So people may not know that they have trauma or are showing the symptoms of trauma or even what it is. They might not be able to identify what was the traumatic event. And the really good news about that is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I'm looking at Victoria, so I'm going to use Victoria as the example, okay? It doesn't matter whether Victoria can tell me what her traumatic event is or not, because what she's doing now, how she's thinking, how she's feeling, how she's behaving, that can change whether she identifies what the event that caused it or not. And that's important because some people simply cannot identify the trauma. They don't know what it is. It happened in a time when they were so young that they can't name it, or they might not remember it even if other people have told them that it's happened. They might have repressed memories. It doesn't matter because we can still help them. It's not a question of let's go back, dig through all your muck, tell me all the dirty details, and tell your story to other people. None of that is necessary. We start with the present and say, what are we going to do now? How can we change and make things better? Other people don't recognize the trauma, or they think, and I think this is true with the pandemic, is what I hear is either I'm fine, which is our standard American answer, how you doing? I'm fine, or that I will be fine when things get back to normal. And so they have some expectation, some idea of what normal is going to be. And when we get there, even though I know I'm having a hard time now, everything's going to kind of slip right back into being fine again as soon as we get to normal. But if we've really been traumatized, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen that we just slip back into being fine because we've been traumatized, and that has an impact. Some people don't want to address the trauma. They know that it's there, but it really provokes a lot of uncomfortable feelings, distressing feelings. Maybe they know that when they have the feelings, they act out in some way that causes problems for them. And so they simply don't want to address it. And the fact of the matter is, if I bring up any word like powerlessness, who really wants to go there? I deliberately say it when I preach sometimes, and I can watch the congregation squirm because I simply said the word powerlessness, and that's not an experience that we want to talk about. So new trauma, the pandemic has also stirred up a lot of old and unresolved trauma for a lot of people. The consequences are expectable. Catholic Cares Coalition is going to make some handouts available to you that you can go to, so you don't have to madly write these notes down, but I'm just going to point out a couple things. In terms of emotions, we tend to experience our emotions in extremes, either by preferring to stay numb so that we don't experience our feelings because they're so uncomfortable, or when we have the feelings, they tend to be extreme because we don't know how to manage them. It's like the volcano that you hold it in, hold it in, hold it in, and then it explodes and it's big, and then you behave poorly because your emotions are big. And so it just proves again that I've got to get back to feeling numb so that I can survive and that I don't cause behavioral problems. The behaviors get problematic because of our thinking, which is extreme, and then trying to manage the feelings. We don't know how to do it very well, especially if we have childhood trauma. And our thinking gets very messy and distorted because we're trying to make sense out of things that don't make sense, out of things that we don't understand, out of things that we don't have the ability to explain well. And so that affects how we think as we contort our thinking, trying to make sense of something that we're not making much sense about. And that just causes more problems for us, and affects our feelings, and it affects our behavior. We know and can recognize other people that have trauma and need help. And so some of our recognition now, even during the pandemic, is some people, even though we have programs available, are feeling so fragile that they can't do the work yet. They are really literally just trying to survive the day-to-day stuff and the new stuff that's on their plate, and the idea of doing any kind of therapy, any kind of group work just seems overwhelming. They just can't handle it yet. Unfortunately, there are also people that just don't know the resources are there. They don't recognize their own trauma and recognize that there are resources available to help them. And some people just don't want to do the work. Okay. The sad part is no one else can do the work of healing. I can't wave the magic wand and make them better. They have to do the work in order to make themselves better. It takes personal effort, and some people aren't willing to make the personal effort. And so they prefer the status quo, even though they're miserable, but it's the misery I know instead of heading into something new and I don't know how it's going to turn out. So some steps for healing are: one, learn to recognize the signs of trauma. One of the handouts that I'm making available, and the handouts are available in English and Spanish, is to learn to recognize signs that there's trauma, or help other people to recognize it when we can't see it for ourselves. Second of all, to normalize it, which is to say it is expectable. You are simply behaving the way someone who's had trauma would behave and think and feel. There's nothing abnormal about you. You're behaving in a normal way according to what has happened to you. Then make resources available. We have 3 programs primarily: church-based programs, community-based programs, and site-based programs. Site-based programs are for clientele in specific sites like the county jail, the probation program, the domestic abuse shelter, employment training center. So it's specifically for their clientele. Other programs are just open to community members at large. And then we also have faith-based programs that are run through the church. And then finally, we have a program that's online that's specifically designed to help people connect their experience of the pandemic with the experiences of trauma and what we can do to recover from trauma. Those programs really have 2 big fields. One is to understand the trauma and impact so that I begin to recognize myself and why I'm doing the things that I'm doing and saying and feeling. And the other part is skill building, that I can do things differently. There are skills that I can learn to help me live a healthier and more satisfying life. So programming available. We're going to put a link on the chat room so that you can go to our website so you can find out more about those programs. And then there will be some handouts available that talk about signs of trauma, what are the core concepts of recovery, and some resources that you can access, as well as a couple of books that I wrote that may be right for certain populations. So thank you, and back to you, Victoria.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm just putting those in the chat for you quickly. So there's those two
Thank
books,
you.
and then also the website that Father Ken referenced. For my portion, I'd like to do something a little bit different. So as Margaret mentioned, I work with her in Word and Witness, and I've been really working on the formation sessions to support the work of the coalition from a logistics standpoint. So I've been doing a lot of the technical and administrative work. But throughout this experience, my family was going through an experience of COVID. And so I just felt that it would be timely, especially for this session, to share that. And I wanted to bring in some of that rich storytelling piece and provide those that are on the call and those that might be watching later just a little bit more about what COVID looks like through the eyes of a family that experienced it. So I'm going to tell you a story for the next few minutes. And it's deeply personal. I'll use some pictures to help illustrate, but I'm going to tell it through my eyes and through that of my husband. And I hope that throughout the telling of this story that you're able to recognize the complexity of the situation of COVID. I know that for myself, I oftentimes felt that the person as a minister, that your job was to accompany the person who was ill, as well as maybe the immediate family. But I think that you'll see in the telling of my story that there's so many layers to that. And hopefully we can begin to recognize the layers of trauma that are experienced not only by the immediate family, but by healthcare officials, the larger community, the person who maybe infected somebody else, because the reality is that all of these people are part of our faith communities right now. And so as you listen, I would ask that you ask yourself, how are we as a faith community accompanying and supporting and responding to those that are in our care, being mindful of perhaps the trauma that they're carrying. So I'll start by saying that on July 3rd, my husband and I were going to celebrate the holiday with our family, just as we normally would have. And my father-in-law called to let me know that my mother-in-law would not be joining us, and neither would my sister-in-law, because they were under the weather with what was thought to be a head cold. And so in talking with them a little bit more about their symptoms and kind of what they were experiencing, it became pretty apparent that we thought it was something a little bit more than that. My husband and I both had COVID early on in November, and we thought that a lot of the symptoms that they were experiencing were similar to what we had. And so we insisted that they didn't meet with us. And we encouraged them to go and get tested. A few days later, we called back to check in, and Jennifer, my mother-in-law, was really too weak to come to the phone. They had made an appointment for her to get tested, and we were waiting on the results. And we also found out that a coworker of hers had tested positive about a week prior, and every person in her front office was currently COVID positive. So to no surprise, her test came back positive as well. Later that night, just about 12 hours after her test came back positive, Dan, my father-in-law, said that he needed to take her to the hospital. She spent the night in the ER and was immediately placed on high flow oxygen. And when she was in the ER, she was immediately at 100% capacity of high flow oxygen, meaning that they had to keep it all the way up to keep her breathing. She was admitted to the ICU, and they did some tests and found that she had double lung pneumonia. And so within just a few days, they placed her on what's called a BiPAP machine, which is a non-invasive ventilator. And you can see that in the picture here. She had to have the mask on her continuously. And so when she had the mask on, her blood oxygen level would stay in the high 80s or possibly low 90s. But the moment that she'd take it off, whether it was to eat, move, anything, she'd drop down into the 70s. And they had to max her out on this as well. So she was at 100% using the BiPAP to breathe. As you can see, this is something that's really uncomfortable. And as for, for days, she continued on in this way. As if this wasn't bad enough, my sister-in-law was also admitted to the hospital and was found to have double lung pneumonia as well from COVID. She was on high flow oxygen and was able to receive a convalescent plasma treatment that would help assist in her healing and eventually in her recovery. And for my mother-in-law, that just wasn't something that was an option. I'll pause here and mention something that's really critical to COVID patients. You know, under normal circumstances, when you have a loved one who's sick or you're accompanying somebody who's sick, you're able to communicate with them and kind of gauge how they're feeling. You can see with your own eyes how they're doing and make assumptions on maybe what's next in their care. It's possible that, you know, under normal circumstances, the patient might also be able to advocate for themselves. But with a COVID patient, you don't see or you talk to anybody. In this picture here, you can tell it's kind of taken on a phone. This nurse had to use their personal cell phone to allow us to have this time. My husband has an Android and the nurse had an iPhone. So my husband had to borrow his boss's phone to even be able to have a few moments with his mom, because there was no other way to allow for any kind of communication or connectivity. Also during COVID, because nurses are so strapped for time, they limit contact to just one person. So there's one point of communication. So that's essentially difficult too. I want you to think about that. You know, for this, it was my father-in-law, Dan, but Dan lives 40 minutes away from the hospital where his wife and his daughter are. He's working, he's sleep deprived and exhausted. He's going through something traumatic. And he doesn't have a medical background. So he's doing the best that he can, but he can only ask what he knows. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. And so the extended family, you know, my husband and myself, as well as others, we're kind of only getting watered down bits of information because nurses aren't able to talk to us directly. And the time that Dan has with them is so incredibly limited. For the larger family, like aunts and uncles and cousins, we found that it was a lot of accompaniment and really traumatic for them. They might have heard that Jen was ill, and then the next they hear she's on a non-invasive ventilator. And without constant communication or a way to keep them informed, they're trying to process their own grief and their own realization of what's happening. And so my husband and I really took on that role for that larger family to make sure that we were communicating with them and accompanying them, making sure that their questions and their concerns were being addressed and answered to the best of our ability. After several days with really no progress on the BiPAP, the doctors began talking about a ventilator. And so to make sure that we were making the right decision, I pushed for a healthcare consult. And this is where the whole medical team, doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, hospital ethicists, they meet with the family and talk about what's next. The kind of blessing in disguise is that we had to be on site at the hospital. So we actually got to stand outside of her room for this care consult for just a few minutes while we were waiting. But that time really ensures that everyone hears the same thing and that everyone is in consensus over what's being done and what's best for the patient, in this case, my mother-in-law. Jen did have a DNR, but something like intubation is kind of that gray area because her and her husband imagined that a DNR would be for something really traumatic, like if they went through the windshield of their car. They hadn't really thought of this scenario like a virus. And even in something like intubation, there's a lot of gray area. If a patient's non-responsive on an intubator, they'll usually do a tracheotomy, and a tracheotomy may or may not be permanent. And so if there's something where the patient needs permanent, feeding tubes or permanent oxygen, that might violate the DNR, but the actual act of intubating might not. And so as a family, we're trying to do the best to, of course, give our loved one the best chance, but also honor the legal document that's been signed. And a lot of times these decisions are being made by younger people that don't have experience with that. In our experience, it was my father-in-law along with my husband who were primarily the ones making those decisions. But while we were there, we had to wait 3 hours for our care consult because the doctor was attending to a 36-year-old who had 2 strokes and wound up in a coma and had to rush and address that before he could be with us. And so in that case, it could be younger people in their 30s or even siblings who are making those decisions for their parents. And just how do you accompany them as they're going through that as well. I'll pause here again and say that when we met with the medical team, they were, I would describe them as saying they were unbothered. And I think perhaps that my husband or my father-in-law thought that this was a good sign, that maybe it wasn't as serious as it was. However, years of working in a church told me that they had really reached compassion fatigue. For them, this was just another patient and just another Tuesday. There were dozens of patients in the ICU just as sick as my mother-in-law, and the reality was that none of them were going to live. And so I knew, and my husband knew, that we really had no control over the outcome of her care. We knew that she was getting the best care possible, but we did have control over how we accompanied the nursing staff and how we practiced kindness to them. So we made sure that we expressed deep gratitude and appreciation for each of them from day one. We tried to make sure that we brought them gifts. We talked to some of our nursing friends and said, what would other nurses appreciate? And we brought them gift cards and, snacks that they could have, really tried to affirm them. And we also wrote them a note about Jennifer, because we realized that with a COVID patient who's not responsive, they know nothing about her other than what's on her charts. So we wanted them to humanize her a bit and know a little bit more about her life, her accomplishments, and what it was that she was experiencing, to help them also process and realize that this was a person in front of them and not just another patient or another number. Eventually, we did decide that it was time to intubate. And when it became time to do that, by some grace of God, Dan was able to be in her room and be with her. He was in full PPE, and he set up an iPad for us because the hospital had run out of devices. And my husband and I got to be on a phone like what you see here, and we got to talk with her for 3 hours before they had to, usher him out so that they could intubate. I'll say at this point, she was clearly exhausted. She was in distress. She was not aware that her husband was in the room. She was aware somebody was with her, but I don't think she knew it was her husband. And for 3 hours, she didn't say anything except 4 words. So for 3 hours, we watched her in distress, and my husband said, "I love you, Ma." And her response was, "I want to die." And that was all that she said in 3 hours. And those were the last words that my husband ever heard his mother say, were "I want to die," because of how badly she was suffering. So again, recognizing that the larger family would not really have an opportunity to speak with her, Andrew and I went and bought out a digital recorder. We asked everyone in our family on both sides to record messages of support, and we compiled them into one audio file. And we put them on the recorder, brought it in, and had the nurses play it for her through headphones, just hoping that perhaps it would bring some comfort to Jen to know that she wasn't alone in these times. My husband and I also recognized how privileged we were, one, to be able to buy a device like that, because they're not cheap and they're also not easy to find. And two, to understand technology, because you really have to be well versed in technology in order to make that happen. So we wrote really detailed instructions on how to record and how to make that device work in the correct way. And we donated it to the hospital so that other families would have that opportunity as well, hopefully, to provide some support for their loved one. She remained on intubation, but really showed no improvement. And so there was, extensive damage to her lungs that just wasn't helping. I did have access to her medical records kind of in real time, where I could see like her O2 saturation or blood oxygen level and things like that. And I was actually on a call with Margaret for just a normal Tuesday meeting, and I noticed that everything had just plummeted. So I called my father-in-law, who called the hospital, and we found out that she had her lungs collapse. So they put in a tube through her rib cage to reinflate her lungs. And just a few days later, we got a call saying that her O2 saturation had dropped to the 60s and really wasn't recovering. So my husband and I rushed to the hospital, which is an hour away, and we did that in LA, Friday rush hour traffic. And the whole time I just prayed that by some grace of God, someone would have mercy and let my husband see his mom. And they agreed. So here's a picture of my husband with his mother. He was in full PPE, but as a family, we got to spend about 5 hours with her. We took turns talking with her, saying goodbye, making sure that we understood what the options were and what the process would look like for comfort care. And I can tell you that she was definitely ready to go. So, we were really lucky, like I said, that the whole family got to go in, myself included. But when my husband sat and talked with her, her O2 saturation was in the 60s. And when he was done talking with her, it immediately dropped into the 30s. And so we knew that at that point, it was imminent. A respiratory therapist came in and extubated her. And for 12 minutes, we stood by her side and watched her as her life ended. And she took her last breath at 8:45 p.m. on July 23rd. And so while this experience is really difficult, and I think you can probably hear that in my voice, I consider it such a privilege and a gift that we were able to be present and that we were able to see a side of COVID that so few people get to have. Throughout this process, I've never heard of another family who's been able to be in the room with their loved one as they've passed. And, it's been about a month now. my husband and I have just been really doing our best to stay close to each other as a young couple. We've been married about 5 years, and it's difficult for us. It's difficult for the rest of our family. We had the privilege of bringing my mother-in-law home. She was cremated, and we have her with us here. She's actually in the room with me right now, but we have the honor of keeping her with us here. My father-in-law and sister-in-law are really adjusting to their new routines and life without her. And we've been working to kind of settle affairs and get death certificates and clean out belongings. And even that's been hard because within the family, there's different desires. Some really want to move quickly in processing all of that. Others prefer to take their time. And so there can be tension there. There's questions, you know, did we do enough? Did we do too much? Did we honor her life well? I know that the woman who gave her COVID has been processing things in her own way. And while my husband and I don't hold animosity towards her, and we know that there's nobody's fault, there are things that could have been done differently to mitigate or possibly change the outcome. And so that's something that's difficult to process through as well. There has been an outpouring of love from the community and from people that didn't even know her, but knew us and wanted to show their support. And I'll say that while that has been really difficult to process, the strength of the community, as Bridget mentioned, has really been what's sustaining us. The number of questions that I get asked are vast, but the two that I get asked the most, the first is, was she vaccinated? And the answer to that is no, she wasn't. She was afraid. We had talked about it, and she was just very fearful of the potential side effects. She saw that Andrew and I recovered really well in November, and just, I think, assumed that if it had happened to her, that she would be the same. And the next question that I get asked is, did she have pre-existing conditions? To her knowledge, no. However, her labs indicated that she may have been diabetic. And my response always, though, is so what? Because unless you're getting full metabolic panels, or unless you're getting a health screening monthly, who's to say that you and I don't have a medical condition that we aren't aware of? Most people find out when they're in the midst of a traumatic experience. And even if someone does have a pre-existing condition, that doesn't mean that their death or their suffering was any less tragic. And so from a ministerial perspective, I think that when we talk to others, we need to make sure that we're leading with compassion. And if our first response for a grieving family is, did they have a pre-existing condition or were they vaccinated, we're kind of missing the mark. You know, again, Bridget talked about how the community can play such a pivotal part in healing. The community has that power to heal, but it also has the power to wound further. And so that's been something that I've been really conscious of, just myself and how I approach other families. And the last thing that I'll say here is just that vaccines work. My father-in-law was vaccinated, living in the same house as 2 COVID positive people. He tested negative twice and never got it. And my husband and I, while we are vaccinated and we were in full PPE, we were in a hospital with COVID positive patients, and we tested negative as well. So I want to make sure that her life is remembered and that her death is not in vain. And we've really been pushing for vaccine acceptance in our own circles. If you'd like to know more about her, you're welcome to visit the website that we set up for her. And then if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer that later in the panel. This is a safe space to ask whatever you like, even if it's difficult to ask. So thank you so much, and I'll turn it back to Margaret. You're muted though.
Thank you so much for your powerful sharing, especially around that theme of powerlessness and the reality that we as a community don't often realize the amount of trauma we are experiencing. I appreciated Father Ken identifying that early on, that we might not know that we have a particular trauma that we're, are going through in the midst of this pandemic, something that's being triggered within us, or something we are literally ongoing. I think that that's really hard for us to identify because at this point in the experience, with data changes, law changes, family life changes, reality changing, many of us keep focusing on that sense of normal that Father Ken brought up, which I'm now connecting to much of the behavior that we're seeing in our families and our communities, that sometimes even within ourselves, right, that rationalize decisions and choices that may not make sense to others, and it can also feel extremely dismissive when we're focusing on normal, when we have people in our community undergoing these very traumatic experiences of accompanying others, or even ourselves, right, through the experience of testing positive or affecting somebody else. So on that, I'm wondering, Father Ken and Victoria, what do you think of that tendency to focus on normal and that whole rhetoric? How does that affect people, and how might we as church leaders be attentive to that kind of language and focus, that might, how do we better kind of change that narrative so that we're being more intentional about accompanying others? Do you have any practical tips on that to assist us?
One, I would talk about it as opposed to not talking about it. I constantly encourage people to bring it into the conversation, that trauma is normal, that 50 to 70% of our population has traumatic events in their past. So pretending like it's not there or that it's some tiny little subset. When I train clergy, I'm saying, look at your congregation and recognize that it's not, 2 people in your congregation that have trauma. It's half your congregation has trauma. If I could respond to something that Victoria said close to the end with her two questions, it underlines a dynamic that's not always an intention, but those 2 questions are both really forms of blaming the victim, right? We forget that they're a victim because they have a disease, and we're going to blame them because they weren't vaccinated or because they had a pre-existing condition. We find some way to pin it on them, which allows us to detach from that in some way and not feel it as simply the fact that this is a tragic illness and a tragic death. And we have to be very careful about that. We notice it more now in the questioning that happens, for example, around domestic abuse or around rape, right? Where we ask these questions, did you scream? What were you wearing? Had you been drinking? But they're all forms of blaming the victim again, instead of placing the responsibility where it belongs. And so we have to be very careful about that.
Yeah, I would echo that very much. It's difficult sometimes for me because as a minister, I understand that people are oftentimes asking those questions because they're looking for a way to rationalize it and to justify their decisions or lack of decisions. And so I think that to answer that question of how do we really accompany, it's just being present, having the conversation. I think more people need to be vulnerable, to have an authentic witness, to allow there to be dialogue around what COVID looks like. That's part of why it was important for me to actually share pictures of what it looks like, because I think sometimes we are blind to things that we don't want to see. But to just be open to those conversations and support one another is really crucial in the community. And to know that all of these layers, the person that didn't get to say goodbye, the person who may have infected someone else, the person who's grieving, the person who had to make a decision, the person who recovered, all of those are within our faith communities, and we don't really know what that person's experiencing. So how can we be present to them and just be gentle with one another?
And all the medical personnel.
Yes.
The program that we created called Renew was originally a request for helping nurses and other medical personnel, but it was the Nursing Association of the state who approached us and said, can you write something? Because the nurses themselves are experiencing trauma every day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as a person, again, representing an organization that's focused on catechesis and evangelization, I see many of us in the room are coming from these diverse ministries. I think the opportunity here from both of your sharing is that we have the ability to really accompany people through a different lens at a particular time in history that is still unfolding, and to really identify trauma as a centralized entry point, even though it's a very painful entry point, to walking alongside somebody, but also even into a deeper self-awareness so that I can be a better minister to others at my capacity too, kind of really accentuating that piece of vulnerability, Father Ken, that you mentioned. So if you were to give one hopeful shift for church ministry today, if you could identify kind of a way to integrate trauma ministry what would you advise, or what would you envision if we had no boundaries and we had all the resources in the world? What would you really think would make a great impact at this point in time?
Well, my vision is that every parish and every entity would have some kind of trauma recovery program. I mean, if you think about the programs that we have for various people and what amount of the population there is, I think that the church, and it's the first word practically that Father John used, it's about healing. The church should be about healing all over the place. And there is a huge amount of healing that needs to take place within our communities. And I'm going to go back to your word though, Margaret, because I forgot to say it at the end, which is always to offer hope, because offering hope in the first place already has a therapeutic effect. And because we know people can get better from trauma. This is not, we pronounce trauma and therefore, I'm sorry, you're stuck, you're doomed, and this is the way your life is going to be. No, trauma is recoverable. We know how to help people recover from trauma. So to say that to people who often feel stuck and have come to the end of the line, they think, and that nothing can be done for them, and to say, no, it can be different and your life can be much better if you're willing to do the work. We know how to recover from trauma.
Agreed. I would also add to that, small group communities, I think, would be really beneficial in addition to having some kind of professional services. I know that, you know, my husband and I were really fortunate in that we knew that we had a good support network and we knew what resources were available to us. But I know that that's not the case for everybody. And actually, my husband's best friend lost his mother to COVID really early on in the pandemic, and was in a city that he hadn't lived in or grown up in for very long, and didn't really know where to turn, didn't have that community. And when you're looking within your own friend circle, regardless of what age you are, your friends or your colleagues might not have the skills to be able to help you work through trauma. So to know that you have a small group community within a church or a parish or a faith center that can support you and provide that hope and perspective, as well as healing and some skills for trauma and grief, would be very helpful.
Well, I'm so grateful to you both for your powerful testimonies and the powerful work that you're doing, Father Ken, to accompany people through trauma, and your generous offering of your resources to this particular community to utilize and empower locally. Again, thank you, Victoria, for your powerful witness of your mother-in-law's life and the journey that you are undertaking. I'm now going to ask that we bring all our panelists together for any additional comments or insights that they might have, especially after hearing one another, that they might want to offer to the group. I'm just going to try to do a multi-pin. I'm going to have to remove myself here, I think, or Victoria, are you able to help me with that? I'm trying to do this pinning.
Yeah, I'm working on it. There we go.
Got it?
Mm-hmm.
I think Bridget, I'm still got it. Oh, I think pinning Bridget unpinned everybody. Sorry, I'm gonna go ahead and
No, I think
unpinned.
you're fine. You're fine. We're all together.
Oh, we are? Okay, great. So panel one, panel two, any insights or comments that you'd like to make to the larger group or to one another around your learnings of accompanying one another through these two excellent presentations? I saw Father John had placed some information in the chat.
Yeah, I just put a bunch of information out there because part of the trauma that we're dealing with is these are people that come to parishes. They were already coming to parishes. So I think when, Ken's speaking about, the trauma, so I guess I'm looking at the kind of more traditional definitions of trauma, which show that how are people traumatized? And I think a lot of the undocumented community, a lot of our Spanish-speaking, monolingual Spanish-speaking community has just a lot of that issue. And we're finding that out as we spend the time to listen to folks and really hear their stories and accompany them. There's just so much trauma there. But I also wonder, like what Ken was saying, is that if he says that the population has experienced some level of trauma, how that's contributing to the political discourse. That's just my own wonderment at that point, just because there's such anger and it's such irrationality that to me it's something else that's going on. So that's kind of where my take isn't on that, is that there must be something else that is underneath this, and that we're suffering from such toxicity publicly and around this particular disease. Like Victoria's saying, how can people, say the things they're saying, while you're going through this, and only somebody that is not really connecting emotionally to their own emotions and emotions to somebody else, that there's a break. So to me, it just says that's something that's indicative to me. It's a symptom that there is something that's going on. So I don't know what maybe, because Bridget and I haven't talked about this, but I just wonder what Bridget and what Ken are saying in terms of from your guys' own professional perspectives are. Could that be a possibility?
Oops, my mic was off. But yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that the way that each of us is handling COVID and all the repercussions that come from it, whether or not it's a person who lived through something that Victoria has lived through, or if it's a person who became unhoused because they lost their job, or if it's a person who, lost one of their children and their kids weren't able to go to school, what have you. All of this contributes to a larger conversation, and it definitely brings in more animosity. So I think the best way that we can help, like what Victoria said, is to really humanize the experience, to know that when we're talking about people, we're talking about someone's mom, someone's dad, someone's child. And we're talking about the fact that people don't know, people don't know what they don't know. You can hear all day, every day that you should get a vaccine, that you should, wear your mask, and all of those things are good. And you should, absolutely. And when somebody doesn't do that, it doesn't make them a bad person. It doesn't mean that they were trying intentionally to harm other people or to get themselves hurt. So Victoria, I just want to give you a big hug through the screen. I had my camera off because I was crying during your testimony. It was super, super powerful. I think that more people need to hear the realities of everything that you shared, because I think if more people had that really deep personal draw on what that looks like up close, more people would get vaccinated, and more people would understand that this is not just something that's fake and in the news. So
thank you. I appreciate that. It was really, like I said, it was eerie standing in the hallway, and 24 beds were in that hospital. All 24 rooms were full, and it was silent because everybody was on a ventilator. It was absolutely silent. I mean, when was the last time any of us went into any kind of a hospital facility, certainly during a pandemic, and heard nothing? And the magnitude of just seeing that firsthand was really eye-opening.
I think there's something to be said to recognize also that we're not outside it looking in and helping other people who are having trauma. We've got to start with the fact that we're all living the experience. We're double layered in some sense, right? We're living the same experience that they're living, different ways, as trauma survivors living in this trauma of the pandemic, at the same time that we're trying to step outside and look at it and be able to be of assistance. We don't necessarily even have the luxury of being free of it so that we can help other people, because we've got to take care of ourselves, who are also being triggered ourselves in a variety of ways, stronger or less, but we're being affected by it too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's that powerlessness that you named, Father Ken. I think that's something for us all to have kind of a deeper prayer about, surrendering to that powerlessness and realizing that no matter what the latest data is, no matter what the latest change in law is, no matter what the numbers are, right, there it is all around individual stories compiling upon each other, making this larger human story that is really, infused with layers of trauma, depending on where COVID has particularly circled around you at a particular moment in this pandemic, which it's been a really, I think, a difficult journey for each and every one of us. And all we can do is walk alongside one another and offer that hope, like you had expressed. So thank you for that.
Margaret, if
yes.
I could really quick, just in response to, that act of powerlessness, for those of us that have perhaps been on some of the other calls, there's always been this sense of urgency that each of us within our own ways needs to be firm in telling people now is the time, there is no time to wait. But I think that what we're hearing today is the importance of balancing that message of urgency, you must get vaccinated and now is the time, with compassion. And also recognizing, as Bridget said, that if people are making decisions that are perhaps what we would deem to be unsafe, whether that's not wearing a mask or not social distancing, that oftentimes it's just coming from a place of misinformation or fear. And so we have that unique opportunity to really step up in a really compassionate way and provide that urgent message, but with care and love, as we're called to do as ministers.
Yeah, I think also too, Victoria, is part of that is like, if we're using it just staff to kind of hear those stories or tell those stories, and that has a certain small amount of reach, but when you, at least for the design that we're trying to do, is like, what if we can train entire congregations to be listeners? If we can, what if we can start training all the catechists to, in trauma-informed care, training the catechist to be able to detect a problem so they can connect the person to a resource, or, train, go into catechism, go into our faith formation parent classes. I mean, we know we all have those classes, right? Where I was a pastor and it was like, oh, these poor parents have to suffer through 2 hours while their kids are, and we have multiple meetings and we're trying to figure out what we're going to talk to those parents about. And, to really think that through, what kind of training could we actually use and rethink, our time with our parents, or rethink the time of how we do catechetical training when we're going to our deaneries and our small formation groups. What can we do to use that time to train people to be listeners? Because we found that when we are promotoras and we train people in being promotoras, that there's a real skill of just kind of talking to somebody from vulnerability. So we lean in on the fact that we're all vulnerable, rather than I'm, in a place of privilege. But it's like placing that story of those who are directly affected, those who are most close to the pain, have the deepest insight, and creating those spaces within our faith formation programs. Because I know that I've gone to those meetings and we spend, of a 90-minute meeting, we spend a good 80 minutes on answering questions about what kind of dresses you can wear for First Communion, what padrinos are going to do, and we're going through all of the stuff that could be handled by giving them a sheet. But instead, we spend all that time telling people things about traffic management instead of human formation. And I'm just thinking, what if we could recreate those meetings when we have the parents present, where we can break them into groups, or we can, have someone like, a social worker or a trauma care specialist come in and speak to these pieces and get people to, ask these questions. I just kind of think there's so many ways that we can just change a little bit of the ministry that we're doing now and infuse it with some of this stuff. But it is hard because we're dealing with catechetical models that are pretty, you think the church is unchanging. Man, I have gone into parishes where, I think glacial movement, and this is like fossilized. It's not even glacial. It's not really glacial. At least you have a chance of melting. There's something that says fossilized and it ain't changing. And that person's been in catechetical ministry, or that youth ministry has been there forever, and it is not moving. And it's like, oh my Lord. Anyway, that's just my grant.
We'll take that as a spirit-led invitation for our particular ministry, Father John. But to uplift what you have said, Pope Francis did institute the ministry of catechists, which is a really great opportunity for the church to really empower lay leadership, to really implement new models of formation in our communities. And what an opportune time. He announced this in the middle of the pandemic. He gave us a new directory for catechesis, which really is all about that accompaniment model you're talking about, and really empowering people to connect faith and life. And what a tremendous time in history for us to really walk the walk and do something different and really walk alongside people. So I thank you for giving our ministry the opportunity to live into this vision. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask one more question, and it's of Jimmy. Jimmy, do you have any recommendations, since we're now talking about innovative catechetical models, formational models, we're talking about instituting ministries for folks that have gone through trauma in our parish communities. Do you have any recommendations on how to tell the story of our communities in such a way that we can partner more effectively, maybe with people that we don't traditionally partner with, but that really could make a tremendous impact, especially at this point in time, or, you know, with philanthropic entities or donors? Do you have some recommendations for us as we consider, you know, the obstacle of resources? We don't want to be blocked by that. We want to consider, how do we move beyond that?
Yeah, what I think is really, really interesting about this type of work is the people that we're serving are usually, in some ways, are our best spokespeople. They're the ones that, as they start engaging with these programs, especially like our parish engagement program. I think of a volunteer that Bridget has. Caesar, who started actually needing our help. He started as someone that was searching for support through our parish engagement program. He was in active poverty and having problem with employment and his family and housing. And through it, we engaged with him and brought him to a place of self-sufficiency. And he now has moved about 30 miles away. And he still comes back and volunteers every Tuesday at our parish engagement site, almost every week, because it's his way of giving back. And so we at Catholic Charities, the way that we've told his story in our newsletter, in mailings, and so using that story of someone that we helped and accompanied through their path to recovery was critical. To starting to engage new donors. One of the problems that we've had at Catholic Charities is our support group in general has slowly been shrinking. We've seen fewer people sitting in pews in parishes as it slowly started it's been getting smaller. And so we've been trying to figure out, how do we engage people that wouldn't normally associate with Catholic Charities, or maybe hasn't heard of Catholic Charities yet. And so telling stories like that, and then leveraging, this is going to sound weird, but social media has been a huge thing. And we actually go to the companies and like LinkedIn, Google, Apple, and we now have employee advocates at each of those companies that are trying to spread the word that Catholic Charities is doing throughout the community. Because even when you think of a company, I'll frame Google, since it's essentially in our backyard, it's in our county. Yes, Google has lots of people that make lots of money at that company, but it is supported by an enormous workforce of people that are on the cusp of poverty, that drive an hour each way to go work at Google, to have those different types of jobs. And so we've now started engaging with those companies, saying we're doing the work within the community to actually help you keep your employees. And so in return, we start asking them for funding and things of that nature. So I guess a long roundabout way of saying storytelling about a program like parish engagement starts with the people that you're serving, and then figuring out creative ways and alternative ways to then spread that message to not only those that might need your support themselves, but then also could support you financially down the road through being able to expand and help more people.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. I think that's very helpful as folks consider implementing some of these ideas in their local ministries and communities. I wanted to thank each of the panelists so much for your tremendous contribution that you're making to people's lives right now, and for being here today to inspire others to also have such a great impact. I'd like to thank all the attendees for coming and being inspired and living into that hope and spreading it in their communities. Thank you so much. On that note, I just to sum up what Jimmy said, I heard it expressed as the heroes of any story are those that are being served and are then continuing that service to others, right? So it's not necessarily the server, but those that are being served that are then rippling out that hope to others. So focus on them as the heroes of all of our stories. So on that note, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to John Michael to lead us in our closing prayer.
Thanks, Margaret, and thank you again for everyone for being here. So this wisdom comes to us from Anne Lamott. You are loved. You are capable of lives of great joy and meaning. It's what you are made of, and it's what you're here for. Take care of yourselves. Take care of one another. Let us pray. God, you have been our dwelling place throughout all time, our safety, our refuge, and our hope. Grant we who have gathered here your spirit of compassion and understanding. Give us your spirit of courage to confront the challenges facing our communities and the ability to surrender when things are changing and out of our hands. And give us the spirit of love to recover from trauma and powerlessness. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. So, people of God, life is short, and we never have too much time to gladden the hearts of those who make the journey with us. Let's go out into the world in peace, and in Christ's name be the humble who make others proud, the poor who have riches to share, the weak who help others be strong, the empty who overflow with loving kindness. And may the blessing of God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be with us now and always. Amen.